This 1885 family photo hid a secret about the child in the center. The package arrived at the Boston Historical Society on a frigid January morning in 2024. Rebecca Torres, the Society's chief photographic archivist, signed for the delivery and carried the carefully wrapped parcel to her workspace in the climate-controlled preservation laboratory. The package came from the estate of the late Jonathan Whitmore, whose family had been prominent in Boston's textile industry during the late 19th century. According to the accompanying documentation, the estate was donating various family artifacts, including several photographs dating back to the 1880s. Rebecca carefully removed the outer wrapping, revealing a wooden presentation box lined with faded velvet. Inside lay a large format photograph mounted on thick cardboard, the kind of formal portrait common among wealthy families of the Victorian era. She lifted it with cotton-gloved hands, placing it gently on her examination table under the specialized lighting designed for analyzing historical images. The photograph showed a formal family group arranged in a typical Victorian composition. A stern-looking man in his 50s sat in an ornate chair, his hand resting on a cane. Beside him stood a woman of similar age, her posture rigid, her expression severe. 3 young adults, clearly their grown children, were positioned around them in carefully arranged poses. But what immediately caught Rebecca's attention was the child seated on a small stool at the very center of the composition. The child, a boy of approximately 8 or 9 years old, sat perfectly still with his hands folded in his lap. His position was central, suggesting importance, yet something about his presence felt discordant. While the family members wore elaborate Victorian finery appropriate to their evident wealth, the boy's clothing appeared simpler, of noticeably lesser quality. His face held an expression Rebecca had learned to recognize in her years studying historical photographs. Not the typical discomfort of long exposure times, but something deeper. Fear. Rebecca reached for her magnifying glass, leaning closer to examine the details. The boy's hands, folded so carefully, showed calluses and roughness unusual for a child of a wealthy household. His hair was cut unevenly, almost crudely. And there, partially obscured by the shadow of the chair, she noticed something that made her breath catch. A thin line around the boy's ankle, disappearing beneath the cuff of his worn trousers. It looked almost like a chain. She immediately reached for her digital camera, knowing she needed higher resolution images to examine what she was seeing. This photograph held secrets that required closer investigation. Rebecca spent the next 3 hours creating detailed digital scans of the photograph. The Society's high-resolution scanner captured every nuance of the century-old image, translating silver halide crystals and aging albumin into pristine digital data. As each scan completed, she transferred the files to her computer, opening them in specialized image analysis software that allowed her to examine details invisible to the naked eye. She started with the boy's clothing. At high magnification, the quality difference became even more pronounced. The family members wore garments with fine stitching, elaborate details, expensive fabrics that caught the photographer's light with subtle sheen. The boy's clothes, by contrast, were coarse, patched in several places, the kind of garments worn by working-class children or servants. Yet he was positioned centrally, as though he were family. Rebecca zoomed in on the boy's hands. The calluses she'd noticed were extensive, covering his palms and fingertips in patterns consistent with heavy manual labor. She'd seen similar markings in photographs of child factory workers from the same era. These were not the hands of a child who spent his days in study or play. These were the hands of someone who worked, and worked hard. Then she examined the area around his ankles. The thin line she'd glimpsed was indeed there, more visible now in the enhanced image. It appeared to be a chain or cord, attached to something beneath the chair or behind it, deliberately positioned to be mostly hidden from the camera's view. The photographer had tried to conceal it, but hadn't entirely succeeded. Rebecca's pulse quickened as she traced the line, noticing how it connected to what appeared to be an iron ring partially visible beneath the elaborate chair's carved leg. She pulled up reference materials on her second monitor, searching through databases of Victorian-era photographs. Child servants existed in wealthy households, but they typically appeared in separate photographs, not posed as central figures in formal family portraits. The boy's positioning suggested he was meant to be seen as part of the family, yet every other detail contradicted that narrative. Rebecca created detailed annotations, marking each discrepancy: the clothing quality, the hand calluses, the visible chain, the boy's fearful expression. She needed historical context to understand what she was seeing. She reached for her phone and called Dr. Michael Chen, a historian at Boston University who specialized in 19th century labor practices and immigration. If anyone could help her understand this photograph's disturbing implications, it would be him. Dr. Chen arrived at the Historical Society late that afternoon, his coat dusted with snow from the storm that had begun falling over Boston. Rebecca led him to her laboratory where she'd prepared a presentation of her findings. As Chen removed his coat and settled into a chair beside her workstation, she pulled up the enhanced images on her large monitor. "Look at this," Rebecca said, pointing to the boy at the photograph's center. "Everything about his presence seems wrong. The clothing, the hands, and this." She zoomed in on the chain around his ankle. Chen leaned forward, his expression growing somber as he examined the details. He was silent for several long moments, adjusting his glasses as he studied each element Rebecca had highlighted. Finally, he sat back, exhaling slowly. "This is documentation of indentured child servitude," he said quietly. "It was more common than most people realize, particularly in wealthy households during the 1880s and 1890s. What you're seeing here is likely an Irish immigrant child, possibly an orphan, bound under a legal contract to serve this family until reaching adulthood." Rebecca felt her stomach tighten. Legal? They could legally chain a child. "The chain is unusual," Chen admitted, "but the practice itself was entirely legal. Families could acquire children through various means: orphanages, immigration processing centers, impoverished parents desperate to ensure their children had food and shelter. The contracts typically bound the child until age 21. In exchange for labor, the child theoretically received housing, food, and sometimes basic education. In reality, many of these children were essentially enslaved." He gestured toward the photograph. "The positioning is particularly interesting. Why place him centrally? Usually servants appeared peripherally in family photographs, if at all. This suggests something more complex. Perhaps they were documenting his presence for legal purposes, proving they had custody of him. Or perhaps this was meant to present a facade of familial inclusion while the reality was far different." Chen pulled out his tablet, accessing his research database. "The Whitmore family, you said? Let me see what I can find." He typed rapidly, pulling up census records, business registrations, and historical newspaper archives. "Here. The 1885 census lists the Whitmore household as including 7 family members and 3 servants. No children are listed separately, which means this boy was likely classified as a servant rather than a ward or adopted child." "Can we identify him?" Rebecca asked. "That will require deeper investigation," Chen replied. "We'll need to examine immigration records, indenture contracts, and possibly orphanage documentation from that period. But yes, with enough research, we might be able to give this child back his name." The investigation began in earnest the following week. Rebecca and Chen divided their research efforts, each pursuing different archival sources that might reveal the boy's identity. Chen focused on immigration records and legal documents, while Rebecca examined the Historical Society's collection for any other photographs or papers related to the Whitmore family that might provide additional context. Chen started with immigration records from Boston's Port Authority, focusing on the years 1880 to 1885. Irish immigration to Boston had been substantial during that period, with thousands of families fleeing poverty and famine in Ireland seeking better opportunities in America. Many arrived with nothing, desperate enough to sign contracts they barely understood in exchange for promised employment and housing. After 3 days of searching through digitized ship manifests and immigration processing documents, Chen found a promising lead. In 1883, a ship called the Celtic Pride had arrived from Cork, Ireland, carrying 247 passengers. Among them was a family named Sullivan: Patrick Sullivan, age 38, his wife Mary, age 35, and their son Thomas, age 6. The manifest noted that Patrick was a laborer seeking factory work in Boston. Chen cross-referenced the name with other records. 6 months after the Sullivan family's arrival, Boston City records showed a death certificate for Patrick Sullivan, killed in an industrial accident at a textile mill. 2 months later, another death certificate appeared for Mary Sullivan, cause of death listed as consumption, the period term for tuberculosis. That left Thomas Sullivan, age 7, orphaned in a city where he knew no one. Chen's search then turned to the records of the Boston Orphan Asylum, which had been the primary institution handling displaced children during that era. The asylum's intake logs, preserved in the Massachusetts State Archives, showed Thomas Sullivan admitted in October 1883. The notes described him as healthy, quiet, suitable for placement. That clinical language masked a terrifying reality. Thomas had lost both parents within months of arriving in a foreign country and was now being evaluated as potential labor. The asylum's placement records showed that in December 1883, Thomas Sullivan had been bound out to the household of Harrison Whitmore, textile manufacturer, under a standard indenture contract. The contract, which Chen eventually located in legal archives, specified that Thomas would serve the Whitmore family until his 21st birthday. In exchange, the family agreed to provide food, shelter, clothing, and basic education. The document was signed with an X mark where Thomas's signature should have been. At age 7, he couldn't yet write his own name. Rebecca, meanwhile, had discovered additional photographs in the Whitmore collection. One showed the family's mansion, an imposing 3-story structure in Boston's Beacon Hill neighborhood. Another showed the interior of what appeared to be a textile mill. But it was a third photograph that provided crucial confirmation. A household staff portrait from 1884, showing servants lined up outside the mansion's service entrance. At the far end, almost out of frame, stood a small boy who matched Thomas's appearance. The caption on the back read simply, "Household Staff, 1884. With Thomas Sullivan's identity established, Rebecca and Chen began reconstructing his life within the Whitmore household. Census records provided basic framework. The 1890 census listed Thomas Sullivan, age 13, as a servant in the Whitmore residence. But the bare facts revealed little about his daily existence. They needed to understand what life as an indentured child meant in practical terms. Chen reached out to colleagues who had studied domestic servitude in Victorian-era Boston. Dr. Patricia Williams, a social historian at Northeastern University, specialized in child labor practices of the late 19th century. She met with Chen and Rebecca, bringing copies of rare documents including household management guides from the 1880s and testimony from progressive-era investigations into child labor abuses. Indentured children occupied a peculiar space in wealthy households, Williams explained, spreading documents across the conference table. They weren't quite servants in the traditional sense, because they were bound by legal contracts that essentially transferred parental authority to the household master. But they also weren't family members, despite sometimes being required to appear in family contexts for social purposes. She pointed to a household management manual from 1882. These guides are quite explicit about the duties expected of bound children. They performed the hardest, dirtiest work: cleaning fireplaces, hauling water, scrubbing floors, emptying chamber pots. They were often the first to wake and the last to sleep. Education, which contracts promised, was frequently minimal or non-existent. Williams pulled out another document, testimony from an 1893 investigation by the Massachusetts Labor Bureau. This investigator interviewed several former indentured servants who had completed their contracts. Listen to this description. The child was kept in the cellar quarters, given scraps of food after the family and regular servants had eaten, and beaten severely for minor infractions. The promised education consisted of occasional Bible readings. The child's clothing was inadequate for winter, causing severe frostbite one year. Rebecca thought about the chain visible in the photograph. Was physical restraint common? Not universally, Williams said carefully, but not rare either. Runaways were a constant concern for families who had invested in acquiring these children. Some used locked rooms, others employed various forms of restraint. The legal system supported the families in these cases. If an indentured child ran away, they could be legally pursued and forcibly returned, much like escaped enslaved people in earlier decades. Chen pulled up the 1885 photograph on his laptop, showing it to Williams. She studied it closely, her expression growing darker as she examined the details. "This photograph tells us something important," she said finally. "The chain suggests Thomas had either attempted to run away, or the family believed he might. The central positioning is unusual, though. My guess is this photograph was taken for legal documentation, perhaps to submit to the orphan asylum or court to demonstrate they were fulfilling their contractual obligations to house and clothe him." As the investigation deepened, Rebecca began examining the Whitmore family's broader history, hoping to understand what kind of people would treat a child this way. What she discovered was a family deeply embedded in Boston's industrial economy, whose wealth had been built on the labor of others in ways both legal and exploitative. Harrison Whitmore, the patriarch in the photograph, had inherited a small textile mill from his father in 1868. Through aggressive expansion and ruthless business practices, he had transformed it into one of Boston's largest textile operations by 1880, employing over 800 workers. Contemporary newspaper accounts painted him as a typical robber baron of the Gilded Age, ambitious, calculating, and indifferent to the welfare of his workers. The Boston Globe archives contained several articles about labor disputes at Whitmore's mills. An 1884 article described a strike over dangerous working conditions after a 16-year-old worker lost an arm in unguarded machinery. Whitmore had responded by hiring replacement workers and threatening to blacklist anyone who supported the strike. Another article from 1886 detailed housing conditions in the tenements Whitmore owned and rented to his workers. Overcrowded, unsanitary buildings where disease spread rapidly through families already weakened by poverty and overwork. Rebecca found records showing that Whitmore had served briefly on the board of the Boston Orphan Asylum in the early 1880s. This connection likely facilitated his acquisition of Thomas Sullivan. Board members frequently had first access to children deemed suitable for indenture, allowing them to select the healthiest, most capable children for their households. It was a system that served the interests of wealthy families while providing orphanages with a way to empty their overcrowded facilities. Whitmore's wife Elizabeth appeared less frequently in records, which was typical for women of that era. But when she did appear, it was usually in connection with charitable activities, fundraising for missionary work, supporting women's temperance organizations, participating in church committees. The irony wasn't lost on Rebecca. Here was a woman praised for her Christian charity while a chained child lived in her household. The Whitmore children shown in the photograph had all gone on to comfortable lives. The eldest son inherited the textile business, the second son became a lawyer, and the daughter married into another prominent Boston family. Census and city directory records traced their prosperous trajectories through the early 20th century. None of the family's subsequent documentation ever mentioned Thomas Sullivan. He had simply disappeared from their official story, as though he had never existed at all. The 1885 photograph, hidden away in a family collection for nearly 140 years, was the only acknowledgement that he had been there at all. Chen's research into domestic labor patterns and household management practices of the 1880s allowed them to reconstruct what Thomas's daily life likely entailed. Drawing on surviving household account books from similar wealthy families, testimony from labor investigations, and memoirs written by former servants, a grim picture emerged of what a bound child's existence would have been. Thomas would have risen before dawn, typically around 4:30 or 5 in the morning, to begin his first tasks, cleaning out fireplaces throughout the house, hauling coal or wood for the day's fires, and carrying water from the pump in the cellar to fill pitchers in family bedrooms. These tasks had to be completed before the family woke, so their day could begin in comfort without witnessing the labor that made that comfort possible. Breakfast for Thomas would have come only after the family and regular servants had eaten, typically consisting of leftover scraps or the cheapest, most basic foods. Household account books from the era showed that families typically spent a fraction on feeding bound children compared to what they spent on regular servants, who in turn received far less than family members. Morning tasks varied, but typically included the heaviest, dirtiest work: scrubbing floors on hands and knees, emptying and cleaning chamber pots, hauling laundry to and from the washing areas, beating rugs, cleaning the stables if the family kept horses. Contemporary descriptions emphasize that bound children performed work considered too degrading or exhausting for regular paid servants, who could quit if mistreated. A bound child had no such option. Afternoon might bring errands, carrying messages across the city, purchasing items from shops, hauling purchases back to the house. Evening meant serving dinner, though Thomas would have remained invisible, perhaps passing dishes to more senior servants rather than appearing in the dining room directly. After dinner came more cleaning, preparation for the next day, and various tasks as demanded by family members. The education promised in indenture contracts rarely materialized in meaningful form. Some families provided basic literacy instruction, often from older children or servants, but many provided nothing beyond occasional religious instruction. Chen found evidence that Massachusetts law technically required education for indentured children, but enforcement was nearly non-existent. Families simply claimed they were providing instruction, and authorities rarely investigated. Sleeping quarters for bound children varied, but typically consisted of the coldest, least comfortable spaces, cellar corners, attic crawl spaces, or small rooms off the kitchen that were stifling in summer and freezing in winter. Thomas would have received 1 or 2 changes of rough clothing per year, expected to wear garments until they literally fell apart. Medical care was minimal, provided only if illness or injury threatened the child's ability to work. As Rebecca and Chen's investigation attracted media attention, something unexpected happened. A woman named Patricia Morrison contacted the Historical Society, explaining that her great-grandmother had worked as a cook in the Whitmore household during the late 1880s. Morrison's family had preserved letters her great-grandmother had written to relatives back in Ireland, and several of those letters mentioned Thomas Sullivan. Morrison arrived at the Historical Society on a cold February morning, carrying a carefully preserved collection of letters tied with faded ribbon. Rebecca and Chen met her in a private research room, where Morrison carefully untied the bundle and began reading excerpts she had marked with paper flags. "My great-grandmother was Bridget O'Connor," Morrison explained. "She came from County Cork in 1887, and she was lucky to find paid work rather than being indentured herself. She worked in the Whitmore kitchen for 3 years before marrying and leaving service." She opened the first letter, dated November 1887. "There is a boy here named Thomas," she read aloud, translating from the Irish Gaelic her great-grandmother had written in. "He is about my cousin Patrick's age, maybe 11 years. The family treats him terrible cruel. He sleeps in a cupboard off the scullery, and they beat him for the smallest things. His hands are covered in sores from the lye soap he uses for scrubbing. He never complains, never cries where anyone can see. My heart breaks for him." Chen and Rebecca exchanged glances. This was direct testimony, a witness account of Thomas's treatment. Morrison continued with another letter from March 1888. "Today I gave Thomas extra bread from my own portion. Mrs. Whitmore saw and screamed at me something fierce, said I was encouraging laziness and theft. She made me watch while Mr. Whitmore beat Thomas with his cane for accepting the bread. The boy didn't make a sound, just looked at me afterward with those sad eyes. I feel terrible guilty." The letters painted a devastating picture of systematic abuse, regular beatings, deliberate starvation as punishment, forced labor even when Thomas was ill, and complete isolation from any kindness or normalcy. But they also revealed something else. In a letter from December 1888, Bridget wrote, "Thomas asked me about the ships in the harbor. I told him some sail to Ireland, some to other places in America. He asked if a boy could work on a ship. I fear he means to run away. God protect him if he tries. Mr. Whitmore will hunt him down." Then came a letter from January 1889 that made everyone in the room sit up straight. "Thomas is gone, disappeared 3 nights ago. The house is in uproar. Mr. Whitmore has hired men to search for him, offered a reward. Mrs. Whitmore is furious, says the boy was ungrateful after all they did for him. I pray he made it away safe. I pray they don't find him." The remaining letters from Bridget's time at the Whitmore household mention Thomas only once more in March 1889. No word of Thomas. Mr. Whitmore's men searched for weeks but found nothing. The family don't speak of him now, as though he never existed at all. With evidence that Thomas had escaped in early 1889, Chen redirected his research toward finding what had happened after he fled the Whitmore household. This proved extraordinarily challenging. Runaway indentured children typically tried to disappear completely, knowing they could be legally pursued and forcibly returned until they reached 21 or their contracts expired. Chen started with ship manifests from Boston Harbor, focusing on the months immediately following January 1889. Running away by ship was risky, but offered the possibility of complete escape beyond the reach of the Whitmore family's influence. He scanned through passenger lists, looking for any Thomas Sullivan or variations of the name. Nothing appeared in the months immediately following the escape. He then turned to newspapers, searching for any reports of a captured runaway servant matching Thomas's description. The Boston papers regularly reported such captures, often at the request of families seeking their property. Chen found several such reports from early 1889, but none matched Thomas's age or description. This absence was actually encouraging. It suggested Thomas had successfully evaded capture during those crucial first weeks. Rebecca, meanwhile, explored another possibility: that Thomas had sought help from organizations that assisted immigrants and displaced children. She discovered records from the Boston Irish Charitable Society, which had been active during the 1880s and 1890s, helping Irish immigrants navigate the challenges of life in America. The organization's meeting minutes and correspondence were preserved in the archives of the Archdiocese of Boston. After days of searching through handwritten records, Rebecca found a notation in the Society's ledger from February 1889. Provided temporary shelter and assistance to a boy, approx. 12 to 13 years, recent arrival from difficult circumstances. Boy seeking passage west, away from Boston. Assisted with documentation and introduction to railway employment. No name was recorded, but the timing and description matched Thomas perfectly. This led Chen to railroad employment records, which proved remarkably detailed for the era. Railroad companies kept meticulous records of their employees, including young workers who served as messengers, porters, and general laborers. The Boston and Albany Railroad's employment ledgers showed a Thomas Sullivan hired in March 1889 as a messenger boy, assigned to the line running west toward Springfield and eventually Albany, New York. More importantly, the employment record listed Thomas's age as 16 rather than his actual age of 12 or 13. Someone had helped him falsify his age to make him appear old enough to be beyond the reach of indenture contracts, which typically bound children until age 21. If authorities searched for a 12-year-old runaway indentured servant, they wouldn't look twice at a 16-year-old railroad employee. Chen traced Thomas's employment through railroad records. He had worked for the Boston and Albany line for 2 years, moving westward with the railroad, eventually reaching Albany by 1891. From there, the trail grew cold for several months before Chen found another employment record. Thomas Sullivan, now listed as age 18, had been hired by the New York Central Railroad in Buffalo, New York, in late 1891. The final phase of the investigation took Chen and Rebecca beyond Boston, following Thomas's trail across New York State. What they discovered was a story of remarkable resilience and determination. Thomas Sullivan had not merely escaped the Whitmore household. He had built an entirely new life, deliberately leaving no connections to his past that might allow his former captors to find him. Railroad employment records showed Thomas working steadily through the 1890s, gradually moving up from messenger to porter to eventually becoming a freight clerk. He had educated himself, learning to read and write proficiently despite having received almost no formal education as a child. His employment evaluations, preserved in railroad archives, consistently praised his reliability, intelligence, and work ethic. In 1895, at age 19, Thomas appeared in Buffalo City Directory records with his own small apartment. By 1900, the federal census listed Thomas Sullivan, age 24, as a railroad freight supervisor, married to Mary Ellen Murphy, with 2 young children. He had deliberately chosen to settle far from Boston, in a city where the Whitmore family's influence couldn't reach him, and where his past as an indentured child could remain buried. Chen found Thomas's World War I draft registration card from 1917, which listed his occupation as railroad freight manager and noted he had 4 children. The family appeared in subsequent census records throughout the 1920s and 1930s, showing Thomas had provided his children with education and opportunities he himself had been denied. His oldest son attended college, something almost unimaginable for someone from Thomas's background. The trail ended with Thomas's death certificate from 1944. He had lived to age 68, dying in Buffalo surrounded by children and grandchildren. The informant on the death certificate was his daughter, who provided information about his parents, Patrick and Mary Sullivan, born in Ireland, both deceased. There was no mention of the Whitmore family, no acknowledgement of the years of his childhood spent in bondage. Thomas had successfully erased that chapter from his official story. But Rebecca and Chen had recovered what Thomas had hidden. Working with his descendants, whom they located through genealogical records, they compiled a comprehensive account of his life. His grandchildren knew nothing of his time as an indentured servant. Thomas had told his children only that he had worked for a family in Boston before going west to find better opportunities. The full truth had died with him. The photograph from 1885, with its hidden chain and its terrified child at the center, became the centerpiece of an exhibition at the Boston Historical Society titled Bound Child Servitude in Gilded Age Boston. The exhibition opened in October 2024, drawing significant attention to a practice most Americans had never known existed in the North after the Civil War. Thomas Sullivan's story, revealed through that single photograph and months of determined investigation, gave a face and a name to thousands of children who had endured similar bondage. Thomas's descendants attended the exhibition opening, seeing for the first time the photograph of their grandfather as a chained child. They also saw the evidence of his remarkable escape and the life he had built from nothing. The chain in that 1885 photograph had been meant to hold Thomas in place, to keep him captive in a life of servitude. Instead, it became evidence of his captivity, and ultimately, testament to his courage in breaking free and creating a future his captors had tried to deny him.